through education. For my CC students, this is Cycle 1, Week 24, History. For everyone else, that just means that we're going to be talking about the Portuguese Empire, and specifically about what happened in Portugal and Brazil when Napoleon came into the picture. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this is the final video for this semester before summer break, but not to worry because Doodling Through Education will be back for Cycle 2. I plan on having all of the Cycle 2 videos available for you starting in August. I am also developing a workbook that goes with the history and science videos for Cycle 2 as well, and that's set to be released in July of this year, 2025. So keep an eye out for that. Now, without further ado, let's start doodling. Like I said, today we're going to be talking about that Portuguese Empire and the relationship between Napoleon and Portugal, as well as what happened when Napoleon threatened Portugal. But before we do that, we need to back up and give some history on this subject. This was a time in history when Portugal had forged a new alliance with England that lasted for really quite some time in history. But unfortunately, throughout much of this time, Portugal's security was a very difficult thing to manage because they had two allies, France and England. But unfortunately, France and England were often at war with each other. These difficulties increased during the Napoleonic Wars, which ended up devastating much of Portugal. And so today we're going to be talking about when Napoleon's armies overran the Iberian Peninsula in 1807 and how this forced the Portuguese royal family, including the future King John VI, to flee to Brazil. And then we will talk a little bit about how later John VI did return to Portugal in 1821, as well as Brazil declaring its independence a year later. So let's back up and talk about this timeline in more detail. Napoleon wanted to invade Portugal, and so with the cooperation of Spanish military troops, on November 19th, 1807, French troops under Napoleon's control set out for Lisbon and were able to occupy it on the 30th of November, just 11 days later. The royal family saw this happening, and thankfully the Prince Regent John was able to escape with his family, courtiers, state papers, and treasure aboard his fleet. This fleet was protected by the British. He then fled to Brazil and was actually joined by many different nobles, merchants, and other people from Brazil. This flight had been so chaotic that 14 carts loaded with treasure were actually left behind on the docks in Portugal. It was on the 29th of November, 1807, that they set sail, and this was just in time because remember, Napoleon was able to occupy Lisbon on November 30th, just a day later. Now, this date marks the beginning of the French occupation here, and while Portuguese authorities were generally pretty submissive toward their French occupiers, many of the ordinary Portuguese people did not agree with this due to the harsh taxes that the French were pushing on them. And so in response, the French would actually execute people who resisted these actions of the French government. this situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and we're not going to go too much into what happened in Portugal, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the royal family and how this led to Brazilian independence. But the situation was dangerous in Portugal, and it would need a trigger from outside to transform this unrest into revolt. So let's now talk about Dom Pedro I. Dom Pedro was actually the son of Prince John VI. When Napoleon conquered Portugal in 1807, Pedro was able to accompany the royal family in its flight to Brazil, and Dom Pedro remained there as regent when King John was able to return to Portugal in 1821. So at this point, Pedro surrounded himself in Brazil with many different ministers and people that would advise him. And they began counseling him that independence for Brazil from Portugal was the best option. So when the Portuguese Parliament preferred colonial status for Brazil, they demanded that Pedro return to Lisbon to complete his political education. Dom Pedro actually refused this and issued a declaration of Brazilian independence. And this is how Brazil gained their independence on September 7th, 1822. It was only within 3 months after that that he was then crowned emperor. And so Dom Pedro is considered to be the founder of the Brazilian Empire and the first emperor of Brazil. And that's all we have for today. Remember to do your 4 worksheets in your Doodling Through Education workbook. And I hope you all have an excellent summer. I look forward to getting back to work in the fall. And until then, remember to be kind, follow God's will, and take care.